essential question of how women in their daily lives, in the lived experience, are challenged with all these structures, and they respond and they resist. From the policy point of view, I'm going to really rely on the Mexican scenario because that's where I'm from, and that's where my experience is. I worked when I was younger for the Ministry of Tourism in my home state, the state of Mexico, which surrounds Mexico City. And I used to work in a really nice program that developed at the beginning of the 2000s to promote cultural tourism in small destinations, as opposed to the traditional coastal tourism market segment of Cancun and the Riviera Maya and Baja California, etc. So going beyond the coast, the Mexican government decided in 2000 that it needed to diversify its tourism product and its tourism offer, and started promoting at a national level what it's called the Magical Towns program. So my case study in the chapter is based on that, and my experience is mostly on the Mexican and the Latin American context. So if we think about policy and gender equality in tourism, the first thing that comes to mind, and I think for us as researchers and practitioners and people who are interested in promoting gender equality, the SDGs are a most go-to, right? Because it's something that has been agreed at a global level. The signatory countries of the United Nations have agreed and they've promoted it. And we understand that gender equality is an objective on its own, but it also interacts with pretty much every other of the SDGs, right? So there's a connection and interaction between gender equality and everything else, but on its own right, because it's a human right, we should also be promoting equality. And I was looking at one of the main indicators that currently the United Nations has to measure how we're doing on gender equality, SDG number 5. And the number one indicator talks about the legal frameworks. Legal frameworks in place in different countries to promote, enforce, and monitor equality and non-discrimination based on sex. So I think if we are to conduct a gender analysis, we have to start with that question at the national level. So the good thing is that there's a global framework already in place. How do we translate that global framework to the national level, the country level, and from the country level to the different destinations, right? To make that notion of gender equality from the formal equality to something that actually impacts in people's lives. So the United Nations World Tourism Organization simply retook the idea initially from the Millennium Development Goals, and after 2015 from the SDGs, they took the idea and said, okay, so one of the things that we should be doing as an agency, the international agency that promotes tourism around the world, is to make sure that all of our state members have steps that support gender mainstreaming, right? For a long time, tourism policy was just so focused on the macroeconomic aspects of income, right, international arrivals, and employment. Those were the three main factors that every country that was interested in promoting tourism was looking after. But now we have a framework at the global level that can also put pressure into countries at the national level to say, wait a second, tourism also has to be promoting gender equality. So at the country level, and again the Mexican case, in this formal sense of equality, Mexico has made huge steps since the beginning of the 21st century. We're talking about the early 2000s, right? So the legal policy frameworks in place already are very substantial, and they incorporate from the Constitution and several federal laws that include the equality between men and women, that include actions to prevent and eradicate violence against women and girls. It includes actions to prevent trafficking of human beings, particularly women and children, right? So the legal framework is robust. It has become, in the past 20 years or so, very sensitive towards promoting gender equality. And particularly the recent reforms in 2011, 2012, and 2014 have included a specific mandate that all development planning in the Mexican context has to include a gender perspective. So this is fundamental, right, for any effort to continue advancing on this path. So there are gender-aware institutions also created in place that try to mainstream the gender perspective, including the National Institute for Women in Mujeres, the National Gender Equality System, and two big national commissions, including the Gender Equality and the Eradication of Violence Against Women. So if you think about these frameworks, of course, they eventually touch the planning instruments. And the planning instruments now deal with specific sectors of the economy. And it's really important because in Mexico, there's one law, the National Planning Law, that determines how all the economic development takes place. And of course, within that planning law are all the economic sectors, including tourism. So for the first time in 2014, the tourism ministry has a mandate, because of the law and the policy frameworks, to include indicators and to include a budget for gender equality in policy actions in tourism development. So these are the reforms. They're very recent, right? We think about it, and it's not that long ago that none of this existed, and none of this put pressure into the Ministry of Tourism or any other tourism agency at the Mexican government to advance the gender equality or women's empowerment agenda. But now there is a framework. So I think it's really important to think about in which country we're traveling, which country we're doing business, in which country we're analyzing from a policy point of view what the frameworks are. I think it's the number one step, to identify what can be done. Because if there are no frameworks, that's the first step that needs to be undertaken. So anyway, in terms of framework, Mexico has advanced a lot in the past 2 decades. And in the tourism sector, specifically tourism policy, the most recent program, which is coming to an end because there just happened a presidential election, so it's going to shift. But these are the actions that were promoted. Affirmative actions to guarantee the exercise of women's rights, promotion of women's leadership in participation in decision-making processes, promoting the full exercise of women's political rights. So it's going beyond, and I think I was happy when I started reading this document as part of my own research, because it's going beyond the traditional economic empowerment, even though it's still there, and it's still very much part of it, but it's going into political rights also. It's going into respect for women's human rights. So it's really advancing the notion, the limited notion of economic empowerment. And of course, as Stroma said, at the global level, it's very similar to the Mexican context. Nearly 60% of the workforce are women in the tourism and hospitality sectors. And those sectors that are related to tourism, which in the Mexican case are mostly food production, handicrafts production by traditional communities, it's nearly 50% also. So there are very high numbers of women participation in the tourism sector. When I was looking at the contribution for the book, I was doing my PhD research, finished 2 years ago, not that long ago, really. And I was working in a town in central Mexico, which is one of the magical towns. And the main tourist attraction is, through its cultural heritage, is a town that has been producing traditional pottery for centuries, right? Even before the arrival of the Spaniards. But since the 60s or 70s, as opposed to producing pottery for self-consumption, this community realized that there were people outside, tourists that came from Mexico City and other bigger cities in the country, that were interested in pottery as a decorative aspect. So they transformed their entire economy from self-consumption, utensils for their kitchen, for cooking, to actually creating things for tourists, right? And that was part of my research. When I was, it was a 2-year kind of ethnographic research with women potters in the town. I lived 2 blocks away from the market, so I had a very easy way to contact them and talk to them and interact with them in all different scenarios, learn about their lives, and this is what I came up writing up in the chapter. But one of the elements that I was really interested in is finding out how certain aspects of the local policy context actually helped to transform the lives of these women. And sometimes these actions were done unintentionally. It was the types of actors that were in place in the political context at the local level that facilitated the organization of some of these women, that facilitated registering them so that for the first time they could access training, capacity programs, because traditionally in the town, it was the men that were leading the workshops and the pottery workshops. And the term artesano was only given to the male head of households. So the women helped in the workshops, but they were not artesanas. They were not considered a crafter or a potter, right? So this traditional barrier and cultural barrier that didn't allow women to run their own workshops and have their own production. But they insisted in pointing to me that when the local major had, what was a very big shift, and for the first time there was a woman in power in 2012, and then another woman followed through. For the first time, the issue of gender equality came to the local agenda, and they started including it in the local tourism programs. So one of the learning experiences from the women in Metepec is that it matters. Who occupies the local government leadership? It matters a lot, because even though at the national level or at the global level there can be great policies in place, it's actually the people in the community, at the local government, that make the difference in women's lives. The ones who can make the decision to include these crafters, for instance, in the local registry so that they can actually be contemplated as crafters and producers, which opens up opportunities for training, for accessing credit, for a lot of other things that the women wouldn't have had access if some people had the idea of including them, right? So who occupies local government leadership positions is a question that we have to start asking at the destination level. What are their political priorities? Because it makes a huge difference. Do they have an interest in gender equality? If not, how can we allow them to become allies? What do they understand by gender equality is also important. Under which terms? And what types of resources, both human and monetary, are put into place to actually follow through to the legal mandate to promote gender equality. And just to wrap up, because I think I'm running out of time, the other important lesson, and I hope we can discuss it in more detail in the Q&A session, and also in our putting the ideas back together after we finish the presentations, is that women's lived experiences should be heard and should be included in these policies. Now, when I went back to the research site, and after I had finished publishing my PhD and writing a couple papers and writing this chapter, I was thinking, well, the next step, and I think for me as a researcher, the next step is how do I allow policymakers to learn about these things? Because the voices of women are really important. It is them who know what's working for them, which kind of measures have been taken at the local level or at the national level that actually affect them and how they are affected and how they allow them to advance or not. So it's kind of like this idea in the making right now in my head, how to move forward and include women's lived experiences and the way that they conceive empowerment, their own empowerment pathways into the policy making process. So that policy does not only respond to the legal mandates, but also respond to the lived experience. Thank you.